the Soul Eater. The tavern was lively that evening, filled with laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the low hum of conversation. It was the kind of place where travelers stopped to rest and locals gathered to forget their troubles. But the moment she walked in, the air shifted. No one knew her name, but she had been through before, an enigmatic figure in a dark flowing cloak. Her eyes, cold and knowing, flickered like dying embers beneath the hood that shadowed her face. She walked with the grace of a predator, her movements too fluid, too precise for any human. A few men turned to look at her, drawn by something primal, something they couldn't quite explain. Ronan was one of them. He sat at the bar, nursing a mug of ale, his attention immediately captured by the stranger's entrance. He had seen beautiful women before, but something about this one held him in a trance. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to lock onto him from across the room, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She approached, her lips curling into a smile that promised more than he could imagine. Without a word, she sat beside him, her presence overwhelming. "You're not from around here, are you?" Ronan asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the quiver in his voice. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "No, I suppose not, but I've been through here before." There was something in the way she spoke, her voice a whisper that seemed to crawl into his mind, leaving him disoriented. He felt an irrational pull, as if everything else in the room faded, and only she remained. "Would you care to walk with me?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing his arm lightly. A simple touch, but it felt like fire against his skin. Ronan hesitated. He knew better than to follow strange women into the night, especially ones as mysterious as this. But reason was a distant memory now. The promise in her voice was too tempting to resist. "Sure," he said, standing and throwing a few coins on the bar before they headed out into the cool, silent night. The moon hung low, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets as they walked in silence. Ronan's heart pounded in his chest, though he couldn't say why. He felt like prey, but he was too far gone to care. They reached the edge of town, where the trees began to thicken, the forest swallowing the path ahead. She stopped, turning to face him. Her eyes glinted in the darkness, and for the first time he saw something beyond their beauty, something ancient and terrifying. "You've been searching for something, haven't you, Ronan?" she whispered, her voice no longer soft but commanding. He blinked in confusion. How? How do you know my name?" Her smile was no longer human. "I know many things." Before he could react, she stepped closer, her hand sliding up to his chest, her touch freezing cold. His breath caught in his throat as a wave of paralysis swept over him. His body refused to move as her fingers pressed against his skin, and he felt it, the tug deep within his soul. Ronan gasped, his eyes widening in terror. She was taking something from him. He could feel it slipping away, his essence, his very life force. It wasn't pain exactly, but an emptiness, a hollowness that grew with each passing second. "You men are all the same," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. "You think you can possess whatever crosses your path? But it's I who possess you." Ronan's vision blurred, and he stumbled, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The last thing he saw was her eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, as the world around him faded into nothingness. Ronan's body lay crumpled at the edge of the forest, a husk of what he once was. His eyes, once vibrant, now stared blankly at the stars overhead. The woman stood over him, her breath steady, her face emotionless. For a brief moment she closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his soul as it coursed through her veins. It had been a long time since she had tasted such purity, such naivete. With a flick of her wrist, she released the remaining traces of his essence into the night, watching as wisps of pale smoke evaporated into the cold air. She adjusted her cloak and turned back toward the village, blending seamlessly into the night once more. Another man gone, another soul devoured. But not all was quiet. In the forest's shadowed depths, something stirred. The wind shifted, and a low, rumbling growl resonated from beyond the tree line, a warning, a reminder that she was not the only predator in these woods. The woman paused, tilting her head slightly, as if considering the presence. her lips curled into a knowing smirk. She was used to the restless spirits that lingered in the places she had fed. They were drawn to the destruction, to the remnants of broken souls. But they could not touch her. She was older than they could comprehend, and her hunger would not be stopped by their pitiful cries. Still, the growl echoed in the back of her mind as she continued her walk into town, as if something deeper, something ancient, was beginning to take notice of her. The next morning, the village was abuzz with rumors. "Ronan's missing," a young woman said to her friend as they passed by the tavern. "They say he was last seen with her," another chimed in, her voice trembling with fear. The men of the village whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances toward the forest's edge. Some claimed to have seen a figure lurking in the night, a woman who moved like a shadow, her eyes glowing like the embers of a dying fire. Others spoke of an old legend, passed down from their grandfathers, about a witch who roamed the land, stealing the souls of men who dared to cross her path. But none of them spoke her name aloud. None of them dared. That evening, a man named Elias sat alone in the corner of the tavern, listening intently to the murmurs of the villagers. He had known Ronan since they were boys, and though he wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, something about his friend's sudden disappearance gnawed at him. He had heard the rumors of the strange woman, but he dismissed them as the fearful ramblings of old men and nervous women. Yet, there was something else. Elias had seen the woman himself. Just before Ronan had vanished, Elias had caught a glimpse of her, tall, cloaked, with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. He remembered the way Ronan had been drawn to her, like a moth to flame, and how Elias himself had felt an unnatural pull, though he had resisted. Now, as he sat there, nursing a mug of ale, he wondered if perhaps there was more to the stories than he wanted to believe. "I'm going to find her," Elias muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. His words did not go unnoticed. An older man sitting nearby leaned closer, his face pale and drawn. "You'd best stay away from that one, lad," the man warned, his voice low. "She's not like the rest of us. There's something unnatural about her." Elias stared at the man for a long moment, but he said nothing. Instead, he downed the last of his drink, stood up, and headed out into the night. If Ronan was out there, if the woman had something to do with his disappearance, Elias would find the truth. The forest loomed before him, dark and foreboding, but Elias was not afraid. He had ventured into these woods many times before, hunting, tracking. He knew them better than anyone. But tonight, as he stepped beneath the thick canopy of trees, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was watching him. Elias pressed on, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the silence became, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, in the distance, he saw her. The woman stood at the base of an old oak tree, her cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. Her back was to him, but he could feel her presence, powerful and magnetic. For a moment, Elias hesitated. But he had come too far to turn back now. "You!" he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The woman didn't move at first, as if she hadn't heard him. But then, slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice soft, but there was no warmth in it. "Not for him." Elias clenched his fists. "Where is Ronan?" She smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Gone, like the others." Something in her tone, the finality of it, sent a chill down his spine. But Elias was not like the men she had taken before. He would not be so easily ensnared. "You're not human, are you?" he asked, his voice steady now. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild curiosity. "No," she admitted, "but that doesn't concern you." "Whatever you are," Elias said, taking a step closer, "you can't keep doing this. I won't let you." The woman's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing. "You can't stop me." Elias reached for the dagger at his belt, but before he could draw it, the air around him seemed to ripple, and she was suddenly there, inches from his face. Her hand shot out, gripping his throat with an unnatural strength. He gasped, his vision blurring as the pressure mounted, but through the haze of pain he could see her eyes, glowing, hungry. And then, just as suddenly, she released him, stepping back with a strange, almost amused look on her face. "You're different," she murmured, her head tilting as if she were examining him. "Stronger." Elias coughed, stumbling back, but he managed to meet her gaze. "What do you want?" he rasped. The woman's smile returned, more sinister than before. "To feed." Elias could barely stand, his throat aching from the woman's grip. He staggered backward, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. Fear wouldn't save him now. The woman's eyes never left him, her expression unreadable as she watched him struggle. "You're not like the others," she repeated, her voice softer this time, almost curious. "Most men crumble at the first touch of my power, but you." Elias straightened, refusing to let her see his weakness. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice still hoarse but steady. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her cloak rustling like dry leaves in the wind. Her presence seemed to darken the very air around her, as if the night itself bent to her will. "I am older than you can comprehend," she said at last, her tone almost weary. "I have walked this world for centuries, feeding on the souls of men who seek power, pleasure, or purpose. They come to me willingly, drawn by their own desires, and I take what they offer." Elias's jaw tightened. "Ronan didn't offer anything, you took him." Her smile widened, cold and predatory. "Did he not? He followed me, just as you have. He sought something he didn't understand, and in the end, it cost him everything." "Then you're nothing but a parasite," Elias shot back, his anger rising, "feeding on the weak, leaving nothing but death in your wake." Her eyes flashed with something, perhaps amusement, perhaps anger. It was hard to tell. "You call me a parasite, but men have always been willing to give up their souls for what they desire. I merely collect what is offered." Elias's hand tightened around the hilt of his dagger, but he knew better than to rush her. She wasn't just fast, she was something else entirely. He had never faced anything like her before, and he wasn't sure what would happen if he tried to fight her directly. But he couldn't let her leave, not after what she had done to Ronan. "Why me?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Why didn't you take my soul when you had the chance?" The woman studied him for a moment, as if considering her answer. "You're different, stronger than the others I've taken. Perhaps there is something in you worth savoring. But not yet." Her words sent a chill down Elias's spine. She was toying with him, treating him like a game, a challenge. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "You won't take me," he said through gritted teeth, his voice firm. "I'm not like the others." The woman's smile faded, and for the first time her expression grew serious. "No," she whispered, "you're not. But you will be mine, Elias. Sooner or later everyone succumbs to their desires." Without warning, she moved again, faster than his eyes could track, her hand reaching out toward him. But this time, Elias was ready. He ducked to the side, drawing his dagger in one fluid motion and slashing toward her. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, its edge sharp and deadly. She dodged easily, her movements almost effortless, but Elias kept his focus, refusing to let her slip away again. He lunged forward, his dagger aimed at her chest, but just as the blade was about to strike, she vanished, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. Elias stumbled, the force of his attack carrying him forward, and he spun around, searching for her. The forest was silent again, the air still and heavy. She was gone. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, his mind racing. He had fought many foes before, bandits, soldiers, even wild beasts, but this was different. She wasn't human. She was something far more dangerous, and she had marked him. Elias knew he couldn't stay in the village. If she wanted him, she would come back, and the villagers would be in danger. He had to find a way to stop her, to destroy her, before she could take another soul. But how could you kill something so old, so powerful? As Elias stood in the clearing, his mind churned with questions and fear. The cold truth settled deep in his bones. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. Back in the village, the rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of Ronan's disappearance, of the mysterious woman who haunted the forest, grew darker with each passing day. Men began to avoid the tavern at night, casting nervous glances at the woods as they hurried home before sunset. But Elias wasn't seen again. Some believed he had gone after the woman, determined to bring her to justice. Others thought he had met the same fate as Ronan, his soul claimed by the creature that stalked the night. The truth, however, was far more dangerous. Elias had left the village, traveling deep into the wilderness, searching for answers. He sought out old legends, ancient texts, anything that could give him insight into what he was dealing with. He had heard stories of witches and demons, creatures that fed on the souls of men, but nothing matched what he had seen. Weeks passed, and Elias's search brought him to the doorstep of an old hermit who lived in the mountains, a man known for his knowledge of the supernatural. The hermit listened to Elias's tale with a grim expression, his eyes shadowed with years of secrets. "You're dealing with a soul-eater," the hermit said quietly, his voice rough with age. "They are rare, but not impossible to destroy. However, you must understand this, boy, she is no ordinary creature. She has lived for centuries, and her power grows with every soul she takes." Elias nodded, his determination unwavering. "How do I stop her?" The hermit's gaze was piercing. "You must confront her in the place of her power, where the boundary between life and death is thinnest. But be warned, she will not be easy to defeat. You will need more than just a blade." Elias's hand tightened around the hilt of his dagger, his resolve hardening. "Tell me what I need." The hermit's hut was small and damp, filled with the thick scent of burning herbs and the faint crackle of a dying fire. Elias stood before the old man, his eyes hard with resolve, though a weight of uncertainty settled deep in his gut. He had fought dangerous men, wild animals, and forces of nature before, but nothing like her. The hermit shifted on his stool, his gnarled fingers tracing the rim of a carved bowl filled with strange dark liquid. His eyes were hollow, as though haunted by the many things he had seen in his long life. He gazed at Elias, the flicker of the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. "You're not the first to ask how to defeat a creature like her," the hermit said, his voice low and strained, as if each word cost him something. "But few have returned." Elias clenched his fists at his sides. "Tell me how." The hermit's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You will need 3 things. Something she desires, something she fears, and something she cannot control." He paused, watching Elias closely, as if gauging whether he truly understood the gravity of his task. "But be warned, each one will cost you." Elias stepped forward, his jaw tight. "I'll do whatever it takes. She's taken too many lives. I won't let her take more." The hermit nodded slowly, accepting the weight of Elias's words. "The first, something she desires, is simple enough. She feeds on the souls of men, on their weaknesses, their needs. But there's one thing that lures her more than anything, love." "Love?" Elias repeated, his brow furrowing. "She's a monster. How could she desire love?" The old man gave a dry chuckle. "Even monsters seek what they can never have. That is why it consumes her. You must offer her something she craves but will never possess. But in doing so, you must be willing to face her hunger." Elias's thoughts churned, thinking of Ronan and the others she had taken. They had been drawn to her, seduced by her beauty and mystery. Their desire had been their downfall. But love? Elias had no love to offer. His heart was hardened by years of loss and survival. Still, if that was what it took. And what about the second thing? What does she fear? The hermit's face darkened. "She fears oblivion. Like all creatures that feed on life, she dreads the end, the nothingness that waits beyond. She has survived for centuries by consuming others, but she knows that one day, her time will come, and there will be nothing left to save her. You must make her confront that fear." Elias nodded, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in his mind. "And the third?" The hermit leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something she cannot control. That is the hardest part, for she controls everything in her domain, the men she takes, the souls she devours. But there is one thing even she cannot bend to her will, her own humanity. No matter how many souls she consumes, no matter how powerful she becomes, there is still a part of her that remains tied to what she once was. And that is where you must strike." Elias's mind raced, trying to process the old man's words. Something she desires, something she fears, something she cannot control. The weight of the task felt insurmountable, but there was no other way. "How do I find her place of power?" Elias asked. The hermit's eyes narrowed. It is where all soul-eaters draw their strength, the place where they first died, where their humanity was stripped away. You must find the site of her transformation. There, the veil between life and death will be thinnest, and only there can she be truly defeated. Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't know where her origin lay, but he suspected the answers were hidden in the forest, deep within the twisted trees where she had first appeared. "Do you know where it is?" Elias asked, his voice tense. The hermit nodded slowly. "There is a place in the woods, far beyond where most men dare to go. It's called the Black Hollow, a cursed land where the very air is thick with death. That's where you'll find her, where she was born into darkness. But once you go there, you may not return." "I have no choice," Elias said, his tone resolute. "I have to stop her." The hermit's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of pity crossing his weathered face. "Then take this," he said, reaching behind him and pulling out a small vial filled with a dark, swirling liquid. "It's the blood of a nightshade plant, mixed with the venom of a silver serpent. It will weaken her, but only for a moment. Use it wisely, for it may be your only chance." Elias took the vial, nodding in silent thanks. He turned to leave, but before he could step out of the hut, the hermit called after him. "Remember, boy," the old man said, his voice grim. "No one has ever faced her and lived to tell the tale. Don't let her lure you with promises or lies. She will do anything to survive. And if you fail—" "I won't fail," Elias said, his voice hard. The hermit sighed, leaning back in his chair as if resigned to whatever fate awaited. "May the gods watch over you then. For if they don't, you will never return from the Black Hollow." The forest was darker than Elias remembered. As he made his way through the thick underbrush, the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him, like fingers reaching out from the trees. The air was colder too, with an unnatural stillness that made his skin crawl. He knew he was getting close. The deeper he ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened as if scorched by some ancient fire. And there, just ahead, he saw it, a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. The Black Hollow. Elias stepped into the clearing, the earth beneath his feet feeling damp and cold. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was so profound it pressed against his ears. In the center of the hollow stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and vines. It looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries, forgotten by time. But Elias knew better. This was the place of her power, the place where she had shed her humanity and become something far darker. He felt her presence before he saw her. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Then, out of the darkness, she appeared, her figure materializing like a ghost. "You've come," she said, her voice soft, but it echoed in the clearing like a distant whisper. "I knew you would." Elias gripped the hilt of his dagger, the vial of nightshade venom tucked securely in his belt. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "It ends here." Her lips curled into a smile, but there was something different in her expression now. Something darker. "You cannot defeat me, Elias," she whispered. "You are mine." Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't waver. He had come too far to back down now. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not yours, and I will stop you." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The clearing felt alive with tension, the air vibrating with an energy Elias had never felt before. The woman stood just a few paces ahead, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The shadows seemed to twist and curl around her as if she commanded them. For a moment the two of them stood in silence, locked in a battle of wills. Elias's hand twitched toward the vial of nightshade at his belt. He knew he couldn't rely on his dagger alone. She wasn't just a physical foe, she was something darker, something that required more than mere steel. But he needed to wait for the right moment. One wrong move, and she would have him. You think you can stop me with that? She asked, her gaze flicking toward the dagger. There was amusement in her voice, but Elias could hear the underlying edge of something else, wariness. It's not the blade you should be afraid of, Elias said, his voice steady. It's what comes after. The woman's smile faded, and for the first time her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She took a slow step forward, her cloak barely whispering as it brushed against the damp ground. You speak of things you don't understand, Elias. You have no idea what I am, what I've seen. You think you can scare me with words? Elias tightened his grip on the dagger. I don't need to scare you, I just need to remind you of what you are. Her eyes narrowed, and for the briefest of moments, Elias saw something human flicker in her expression. A flash of vulnerability, quickly buried beneath layers of power and hunger. She was more than a monster. She was something trapped, cursed by her own need to survive. Your hunger is your weakness, Elias continued, his voice low but firm. You feed because you fear the end, because you know there's nothing left for you beyond this. But you can't escape it forever. The woman's gaze hardened, but Elias saw it, the smallest flicker of fear in her eyes. He had touched a nerve. You think you're clever, she hissed, her voice sharp now. But you're just like all the others. You think you can control me, but you will fall like they did. Your soul will be mine, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Elias stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm not like the others, and you know it. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them crackling in the cold night air. Elias knew he was walking a razor's edge, one wrong word, one wrong step, and it would all be over. But he had to keep pushing. He had to make her confront the truth she had spent centuries avoiding. You've lived for so long, consumed by this hunger, Elias said, his voice softening slightly. But it's not because you're strong. It's because you're afraid. Afraid of what happens when you stop. Afraid of what you've become. Her eyes flashed with anger, and she took another step forward. Enough, she snarled. You know nothing of what I am. But Elias didn't back down. He could feel it, the fear in her voice, the cracks in her facade. She wasn't invincible. She was terrified of her own end, of losing the power that had sustained her for so long. You were human once, Elias said quietly. You weren't always this. You had a life, a soul, just like the rest of us. And now you're trying to fill the void with more souls, hoping it will save you. But it won't. It never will. The woman's face twisted with rage, her eyes burning with fury. You dare speak to me of souls? She hissed, her voice trembling with fury. I have lived for centuries. I have taken more lives than you can imagine. I am eternal. But beneath the anger, Elias saw it, the flicker of fear, the desperate need to hold on to the lie she had built around herself. He had to push her further, force her to confront what she had become. You're not eternal, Elias said, taking another step forward. You're dying. Slowly, piece by piece, with every soul you take. And you know it. The woman's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Elias thought she might strike him down where he stood. But she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen, her eyes wide with fury and fear. Enough of this, she shouted, her voice echoing through the clearing. The air around them seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the shadows coiled tighter, as if responding to her rage. Elias's heart pounded, but he knew he was close. He had to act now. Slowly he reached for the vial of nightshade, his movements careful, deliberate. You want to take my soul, Elias said, his voice steady despite the danger that hung in the air. But you can't, because deep down, you know that what you're doing won't save you. It will only end you. The woman's eyes blazed with fury. I will end you, she screamed, lunging forward with a speed that took his breath away. Elias moved in the same instant, his hand darting to his belt and pulling out the vial of nightshade. With one swift motion, he hurled it toward her. The glass shattered against her chest, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. The dark liquid splattered across her skin, seeping into her cloak, and the shadows around her recoiled as if struck by some invisible force. She gasped, her body convulsing as the venom took hold, her eyes widening in shock and pain. The power she had wielded for so long faltered, flickering like a dying flame. Elias didn't wait. He charged forward, dagger in hand, aiming for her heart. He knew it was now or never. If the venom didn't work, he was as good as dead. But as he moved, she twisted, her body writhing with unnatural strength. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with fury and desperation. "You cannot stop me," she screamed, her voice a broken, inhuman wail. Elias drove the dagger forward, plunging it into her chest. Her scream tore through the night, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the shadows exploded. Darkness erupted from her body, swirling around them like a storm. Elias was thrown back, his body slamming into the ground. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The clearing was quiet once more, the air still and cold. Elias pushed himself up, his body aching, his vision blurred. He looked toward the center of the clearing, where the woman lay motionless, her body limp on the ground. He approached her cautiously, his dagger still in hand. She didn't move. The pale moonlight bathed her lifeless form, and as Elias knelt beside her, he saw something strange. Her face, once so cold and terrifying, had softened. There was no longer the twisted hunger, the consuming power. Instead, she looked almost peaceful. Elias felt a strange pang of sadness. She had been human once, like him, but her need for power had consumed her, turning her into the monster she had become. The forest was silent now, the oppressive weight of her presence gone. Elias stood, his body heavy with exhaustion. It was over. He had won. Impossibly, he had won. But as he turned to leave the clearing, a faint whisper echoed through the trees. A voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind. "You cannot escape me." Elias stood at the edge of the black hollow, his breath ragged, heart pounding. He had done it. He had plunged the dagger into her chest, watched as her power faded, and seen her fall. Yet, as he turned to leave the clearing, the soft whisper from the shadows gripped him in a chilling embrace. "You cannot escape me." Her voice was distant but unmistakable. It wasn't the scream of a vanquished foe, but the quiet murmur of something that lingered, a haunting echo that seemed to crawl under his skin. Elias froze, his instincts telling him that the battle wasn't over yet. He glanced back at the altar, her body still lying there, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The silence in the forest was unnatural, as if the entire world held its breath, waiting. Elias slowly walked toward her, his dagger still in hand. As he approached, a cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a soft whisper of words he couldn't quite make out. His eyes narrowed, and his heart sank with dread. There was something wrong. The woman's body, though motionless, seemed to shimmer ever so slightly. In the moonlight, like the surface of water disturbed by the faintest ripple. Elias knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against her pale skin. She felt solid, dead. But as he touched her, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. He recoiled, instinctively stepping back, his hand tightening on the hilt of the dagger. Suddenly, her body jerked, and a gasp of air escaped her lips. Her eyes snapped open, wide and filled with a dark, consuming hunger. Elias stumbled back, his pulse racing as her body lifted from the ground, her feet hovering just above the forest floor. Her gaze locked onto his, and her lips curled into a smile that chilled him to his core. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive," she whispered, her voice low and haunting. Elias's mind raced. He had used the nightshade, he had struck with the dagger. What had gone wrong? "You think you understand what I am," she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "But I am older than this place, older than your kind. You can wound me, yes, but I will always return. And now, Elias, you belong to me." The shadows around them seemed to move with a life of their own, swirling around her like a dark storm. Elias's heart pounded as he realized the truth. This was no ordinary battle. She wasn't just a creature of flesh and blood. She was tied to something far more ancient, something rooted in the very essence of the Black Hollow. Desperation clawed at him, but he refused to let fear paralyze him. There had to be a way to end this, a way to sever her connection to the power that sustained her. The place where she first died, the hermit's voice echoed in his mind. The site of her transformation. His gaze shifted to the ancient altar in the center of the clearing. That was where her power had originated, where her humanity had been stripped away. If he could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, it would sever her connection to the dark forces that kept her alive. Elias surged forward, ignoring the woman's piercing gaze as he reached the altar. With a desperate cry, he raised his dagger and brought it down on the stone. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and the altar cracked, splitting down the center. A terrible wail erupted from the woman, her body contorting in pain. The shadows around her recoiled, shrinking away from the light that now poured from the broken stone. Elias stepped back, watching as the dark energy that had sustained her began to unravel. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with fury. "You cannot take this from me." Her form flickered, fading in and out of existence as the altar crumbled before her. The power she had drawn from it was slipping away, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. Elias approached her cautiously, his dagger still in hand. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment the rage melted away, replaced by something far more human, fear. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can still walk away. Let me live and I will give you anything you desire. Power, immortality, anything." Elias's grip tightened on the dagger. Her offer was tempting, but he knew better. She was a creature of lies, and no promise she made could be trusted. "I'm not like the others," Elias said, his voice steady, "and I won't be another soul for you to consume." With one final thrust, he drove the dagger into her chest, twisting the blade as her body convulsed violently. A scream tore from her lips, but this time it was different, final, as though the last remnants of her power were being ripped away. The shadows swirled around her one last time before dissolving into the air, leaving her limp and lifeless on the ground. The clearing was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifted. Elias staggered back, breathing heavily. He had done it. He had severed her connection to the Black Hollow, destroyed the source of her power. But as he stood there, the faint whisper of her voice echoed in his mind. Elias left the Black Hollow behind, the weight of the battle still heavy on his shoulders. The forest seemed lighter now, less oppressive, but there was a hollowness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He had defeated her, but her words clung to him like a shadow. The days passed, and Elias found himself restless. No matter how far he traveled, no matter how much distance he put between himself and the Black Hollow, the whisper lingered in his thoughts. One night, as he sat by his campfire, staring into the flames, a chill ran down his spine. He felt a presence behind him, a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. He turned, and there she stood. The woman, pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow and filled with a strange, sorrowful hunger. She didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched him, her form flickering like a dying flame. Elias's heart raced, but he didn't reach for his dagger. He knew now that it was useless. "You're dead," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I ended you." She smiled, a sad, haunting smile. "You ended my body, but not my soul. I will always be a part of you, Elias. The darkness you fought, it's not something you can kill. It's inside you now. You will never be free. Of me." Elias felt the cold seep into his bones, but he didn't look away. He knew she was right. In defeating her, he had taken a piece of her into himself, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. "You won't take my soul," Elias said quietly, more to himself than to her. She tilted her head, her smile fading. "Perhaps not today, but one day you will tire, and the darkness will consume you. And when it does, I'll be waiting." With that, she faded into the night, leaving Elias alone by the fire, the flicker of her presence still lingering in the air. Elias stared into the flames, the weight of his victory heavy on his heart. He had saved others, but the cost had been his own soul. He would never be free of her, of the darkness she had left behind. He had won the battle, but the war had only just begun. Elias left the black hollow behind, the weight of the battle still heavy on his shoulders. The forest seemed lighter now, less oppressive, but there was a hollowness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He had defeated her, but her words clung to him like a shadow. The days passed, and Elias found himself restless. No matter how far he traveled, no matter how much distance he put between himself and the black hollow, the whisper lingered in his thoughts. One night, as he sat by his campfire, staring into the flames, a chill ran down his spine. He felt a presence behind him, a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. He turned, and there she stood. The woman, pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow and filled with a strange, sorrowful hunger. She didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched him, her form flickering like a dying flame. Elias's heart raced, but he didn't reach for his dagger. He knew now that it was useless. "You're dead," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I ended you." She smiled, a sad, haunting smile. "You ended my body, but not my soul. I will always be a part of you, Elias. The darkness you fought, it's not something you can kill. It's inside you now. You will never be free of me." Elias felt the cold seep into his bones, but he didn't look away. He knew she was right. In defeating her, he had taken a piece of her into himself, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. "You won't take my soul," Elias said quietly, more to himself than to her. She tilted her head, her smile fading. "Perhaps not today, but one day you will tire, and the darkness will consume you. And when it does, I'll be waiting." With that, she faded into the night, leaving Elias alone by the fire, the flicker of her presence still lingering in the air. Elias stared into the flames, the weight of his victory heavy on his heart. He had saved others, but the cost had been his own soul. He would never be free of her, of the darkness she had left behind. He had won the battle, but the war had only just begun.